To talk a little bit about using Strategyfinder for working with grand challenges. So what are grand challenges? These are areas that are really complex, with a wide range of different stakeholders, with different expertise and competencies, different values, often very broad in scope. And the two that I'm working on, one is energy transitions and the other is mental health. So with the energy transition, there's two particular aspects. The first is the decommissioning of oil and gas installations. We've got these installations that are no longer viable in terms of producing oil, but they are encrusted with all sorts of soft coral, they are home to fish, and therefore there's a lot to be recommended in terms of the marine environment. But equally well, they will degrade and there's a risk of contaminants. So how do we manage these installations? And depending on who you speak to, there are some quite different opinions. The second part of energy transitions is the closing of coal mines. As we close our coal mines, what happens to the people who worked in them? And the people who relied on those people who worked in them buying their products? So there's lots of transitions going on there, lots of different stakeholders. And in mental health, the same is true. In order to provide quality and equitable care, we need many different partners to work together. Psychiatrists, nurses, carer consumer advocates, all sorts of different people, because each person has a very powerful contribution to make if we're going to understand it in its totality. And Strategyfinder has been really helpful, if not critical, in this endeavour. And one of the things about these sorts of grand challenges is it's incredibly difficult to draw boundaries around them. That as you begin to explore one part, you realise it links to something else, and something else again. So it feels like we need to unpack Pandora's box, but at the same stage that's a little bit scary because there's lots of contributions with lots of interactions, and how are we going to manage all that wealth of information? Because issues impact other issues. Environmental issues relating to the closure of mines and the mine pits impact economic considerations and issues. For example, the costs of regenerating the area. And that will have an impact on some of the social considerations. So how are we regenerating the area? What sort of facilities do we want to provide? There's considerable uncertainty. If we think about mental health, there's uncertainty around the pathways of care. There's not one agreed way of looking after people, and there's always new practices. And then there's dynamic behaviour. So, for example, if we have a misalignment between funding and care provision, that's going to have a negative impact on having effective models of care. And if we don't have effective models of care, that's going to have an impact creating fragmentation of services, which in turn is going to result in inconsistent care models, feeding back into that negatively impacting on the effective models of care. So we can see a vicious cycle. The other thing about these grand challenges is, as I touched on earlier, they involve many people. Many people who need to be able to understand the particular area through those different lenses, understand how different people see the grand challenge, and therefore develop a shared understanding. But they also need to know who's in that grand challenge and build connections with them. So who's who in the zoo? Who are the psychiatrists? Who are the carer consumer advocates? What are their knowledge bases? What are their values? What are the indigenous views? And then there's also beginning to understand how to work together, a sort of governance model, if you like. So how did Strategyfinder help? Well, the first way it helped was that we could easily and painlessly allow people to come together and engage wherever they were geographically. So we could tap into the right people. Our participants were able to put their views in anonymously, providing them with safe spaces so they could be much more open. They were able to do so simultaneously, so they could be very productive because they could all speak at the same time. And time is a very finite facility. Now, both of those, you could say there are a number of packages out there that we could use. But what Strategyfinder also allowed me to do is use the built-in mapping, causal mapping, to help structure the conversations. So as people began to argue for the issues and put something forward, they would talk about the issue, they would talk about what triggers the issue, they would talk about the consequences of the issue in a chain of argument. So that structure was able to be captured. And that structure could also be augmented as others talked about how they saw the issue, what they saw as the triggers, and what they saw as the consequences. And so by building that shared understanding, people got a much better understanding of the whole. And what's more, we're able to look at those contributions in their own right, rather than take too much notice of who said them. Strategyfinder also allowed us to explore the big picture in bite-sized chunks, which is incredibly helpful, so that we could look at different views, different clusters, different chunks of it, and be able to make progress on them, but at the same stage stand back and see what the big picture was. So we took a systems view. We could explore degrees of consensus. Were we moving towards something that everybody felt comfortable with through using either rating tools or preferencing tools? And that's very important when we're trying to negotiate a way forward. And we could analyze the models, these causal maps that we were building, that comprised all those different statements, those different issues that people were making and their connections. And it wasn't untypical in a grand challenge to have a model with many hundreds of views. So that ability to capture the whole, understand it in its richness, and analyze it to see those, if you like, hidden insights was really informative to the group. They could identify those feedback loops. They could identify really significant statements that were central to the overall picture. And that was helpful. And it was helpful to the participants. So if I look at some of the feedback I've had comments like, I really liked doing this digitally over the web. In my opinion, it was more focused than face-to-face. I had more time to think. Or another person noted, it was good at capturing thoughts accurately and keeping the group focused. A third stated, it worked really well in terms of having everybody at the table and begin to see the facilitator link up suggestions in real time. So there was clearly a lot of engagement, enjoyment, and people felt they'd really used their time effectively. But it's not just for grand challenges when we're engaging stakeholders. We need to engage stakeholders frequently, internally to ensure buy-in, externally to ensure the viability of a strategy or action. We need to take a systemic perspective. We need to understand that the actions that we put in place that help us resolve one problem don't cause problems somewhere else because we haven't thought about the multiple consequences. Strategyfinder is really easy to use from the start, either from a participant's perspective or a facilitator leader's perspective. It's easy because it allows you to see the wood from the trees through using these views, whilst also being able to see the interconnections. It's easy to use because it allows people to work at their pace, and that can be incredibly helpful as people get the chance to think and think through carefully what they want to say and where they want to make their decisions.